specific American prophets. There are other classes that will, weeks will focus on prophets, and these are probably the ones you know best. Emerson and Whitman, and Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau, and Lincoln. I'm sorry, Emerson, Lincoln, and Whitman. And let me just begin. When I say prophets, it's both a vision of the United States as a democracy, as reflected in their words, but also in Emerson's case and in Whitman's case, they saw themselves as something of a prophet, less in a religious sense even for Emerson, but more in a sense of being able to inspire and energize and galvanize the nation through especially their writings to achieve a democracy.
So how are you defining a prophet? What is a prophet?
Well, a prophet technically is someone who knows God's will and can act on God's will from a religious standpoint. So, and in fact, what's not coincidental, which I'll start now, so Emerson was raised Unitarian, but he always identified himself much more as a Quaker. Whitman never identified with a specific church, but if he had to hang his hat on a specific denomination or church, it was the Society of Friends. It was Quakers. Lincoln rarely went to church, and there's actually to this day a huge debate on whether or not Lincoln was even religious. I have argued and believe that he is, but he was not a regular churchgoer, although, like these other figures, he knew Scripture better than a number of ministers. In fact, we're discussing the second inaugural. That's one of the few instances. In fact, one of the very few. There are only like 3 or 4 other instances where he invokes God or Jesus or in specific terms. But as you know from reading it in the second inaugural, how he incorporates God is open for huge debate. Not true, not so with Emerson.
Prediction, right?
Pardon me?
A prophecy is not a prediction.
Yeah, it's a prediction.
It's
But
not a prediction.
It's a prophet has endowed with messages from God or Christ, and so they can foresee certain events or believe that they can, and in some cases it can be a prediction with the assumption that things can change so that it doesn't occur. Does that make sense?
Because I would have said that prophetic action and prophetic existence depends on a connection between visionary teaching, the message, and
Right.
exemplary action.
Right, well,
The
that's
prophet
true.
is not just a talker.
That's true, but I would say that it would also be based on faith.
Yes, so then what's the content of the prophecy? So the prophetic message consists of the discovery of some higher form of life.
Right, that's right.
that
Which
is
is,
available.
that's right. That's
And so
exactly
let's say
right.
that's the epiphany.
That's
the
right.
discovery.
Which I'll
And the
discuss.
epiphany in turn informs the prophecy.
Yes, yes.
And in a democracy, the prophecy is something about the possibility of all humanity.
Yes, that's
Plain
exactly right.
humanity.
That's right.
Of rising to a higher form of life.
That's right. Which I'll get into. I have a number of quotes for that.
Excuse me.
Yes. Oh.
We didn't put
Oh,
a.
you don't need a mic.
You need a mic,
I
you
need
need a mic.
Oh, I
I'm
need.
talking without a mic.
Was I talking about? No, I didn't. Thank you.
Okay. Now we're on. Go ahead. Oh, you just, okay. Okay, let me just start with Lincoln. This is a photograph of Lincoln from Southworth and Hawes. Southworth and Hawes were the preeminent photography team in the United States at this time in 1850s. The daguerreotype was the most prominent photography. If you want, let me know and I can bring some in. It's to this day the most detailed form of photography. If you take a magnifying glass and you zoom in, you see more detail rather than grain. And what's significant about Americans and early photography circulated only in the North, partly because of the artisanal nature of the North, meaning that men, women, blacks, and whites, all, in fact, there are examples of all of them being very accomplished photographers because, like other artisanal work, you learn it just by practicing it yourself. You don't need to study or to work with a kind of master printer, or you don't need to be subjugated by someone who makes you do a bunch of work beforehand. And Emerson had himself taken a fair number of times. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American in the 19th century. Whitman is, I think, number 2 or 3 in terms of the number of separate photographs of him. And the daguerreotype, this daguerreotype of Emerson by Southworth and Hawes, people would collect daguerreotypes of other people that they admire or they vaguely know or who are inspirations. And Northerners believed that a daguerreotype contained part of the body and the soul of the individual. So it was a way of communing with someone whose actual flesh presence was not there. Emerson, as you know, was one of the nation's leading essayists. He was one of the leading intellectuals. He was a household name by the 1830s, 40s. He led what's known as the Transcendental Movement. He was an abolitionist, became friends with Frederick Douglass, and was a good friend with Charles Sumner. I was just telling Roberto that during the war, Sumner brought Emerson to the White House. Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator from Boston, brought Emerson to the White House, introduced him to Lincoln. They spent a half day together. Emerson was always anti-slavery, but not until the 1850s was he open about it. His first talk on slavery was following the 1850 Compromise, which was outraged Northerners. He started as a Unitarian minister. He was at Harvard. He left it. Emerson always referred to his faith as being more of a Quaker than a Unitarian. And as most of you know, Quakers begin in England. The characteristic of Quakers is that all humans have, God is within you, the inner light of Christ, the inner light of God. God isn't someone or is not distant, it's in you, which means that you have access to God's will.
And what happened to Emerson at Harvard?
What happened to Emerson at Harvard? He was more religious. He was already saying things that suggested a kind of Quakerism, and the Unitarians did not like that. And he was also not dutifully respectful to the elder ministers at Harvard. and he left. He also left because he felt that he could learn more himself than staying at Harvard. By reading himself, by having a direct relationship with a text. And I'll quote Emerson, he said, "I am more of a Quaker than anything else. I believe in the still small voice, the voice of Christ within you, and that voice is Christ within us." And on another occasion, he said, "If I am anything, I am a Quaker," which reflects this inner light of Christ or God within you, within me, within all humans. It's part of being human. That meant for Quakers that doing violence against the human body, doing violence against humans, was doing violence against God. Which is why Quakers did not participate in the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812 or the Mexican War. They did participate in the Civil War, but not as soldiers for the North, primarily as nurses, as helpers creating forts, fortifications, but very few soldiers, or very few served as soldiers. As most of you know, as I said, the central tenet of Quakerism is the inner light of Christ or God, which is almost the opposite of Puritanism, which was much more popular in the colonial period, still popular in the early Republic, and Puritanism is almost the opposite, because in Puritanism, one can never know God's will. One can never know God's will. It's a central tenet of Puritanism. And because you can never know God's will, it inspired members to look for God's will, to look for signs specifically of God's will. And this framework, this framework, I think, the reason I provide that is that it's a spiritual framework that helps explain self-reliance. In fact, one of the central arguments I would suggest of self-reliance is that reliance on self is reliance on God. Reliance on God is reliance on self. And there are numerous passages that suggest that. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense. Trust yourself. God is within you. Your neighbors, your friends, the nation needs to know your voice, your inner light. And he also condemns envy. In fact, he says envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. Don't try to judge yourself based on other people. Don't feel insecure because your neighbor has a lot more money than you. Don't feel insecure because your neighbor is better looking than you or taller than you. Trust yourself. And one of Emerson's major themes, both as a humanist and as a scholar, writer, orator, and this is true with Whitman as well. I would also say it's true with Melville. I'd actually say it's true with Lincoln, and that is that every human is unique. Each human has his or her own voice, or the potential to develop their own voice. So there's something original in every human. And of these prophets, Whitman goes farther than anyone else. Emerson's, in his essay that you read on self-reliance, to believe in your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, it shall be the universal sense, as I've said. Envy is ignorance, imitation is suicide. He goes on to say, these are just a number of quotes from his essay. Everywhere I am hindered of meeting God and my brother. Everywhere I am hindered of meeting God and my brother, because my brother, has shut down his own temple doors. He's refused to listen to God. He's trying to shut God out and recites fables merely of his brothers or his brother's God. So part of being a full, mature human is to continually listen for that voice of God, and that merges with the voice of the self. And that's what led Emerson was, by the 1850s, reluctantly referred to himself, not that much, but at times reluctantly referred to himself as an abolitionist. It coincided with speeches that highlighted the scourge of slavery and the expansion of slavery in America. The Mexican War virtually doubles the size of the United States, almost entirely for slaveholders. By the 1850s, the rest of the world was abolishing slavery. England, France, most of Europe was abolished slavery in their colonies. And it was easier to do so because slavery was in the colonies, not in the front yard in England or in France or in other countries. Whereas in the United States, slavery was in the front yard. And the U.S. was also unique as a slave society in the United States, was the only slave society in which you cannot define the society without slavery in that the enslaved population has a net natural growth. And in every other slave society, it requires continual imports to sustain the slave population. The reason for that is primarily climate. Most of the slave societies in the Atlantic slave trade were tropics or semi-tropical communities. The United States was a community that was much easier to survive, and the soil in the South was very rich, such that the work didn't kill you. If you're an enslaved person on many kinds of work, but especially sugarcane cultivation, the nature of the work killed people within 10 years. Emerson was beloved throughout the North, regardless of among intellectuals. Southerners hated him. John Quincy Adams, who abhorred the fashionable quest for whatever seemed new, was not thrilled with Emerson. He thought that Emerson was a self-promoter. In fact, he says that Emerson was the leading perpetrator of the wild and visionary fantasies that had recently cropped up in New England. And he said of Emerson, after failing in the everyday avocations of a Unitarian preacher and schoolmaster, first of all, Emerson didn't fail, he decided to leave. He actually had a fairly robust church. But Quincy Adams says after failing in these avocations of a Unitarian preacher and schoolmaster, he starts a new doctrine of transcendentalism, declares all the old revelations superannuated and worn out, and announces the approach of new revelations and prophecies. John Quincy Adams was not a prophet. He didn't see himself as a prophet. Emerson did. In fact, John Quincy Adams grouped Emerson with abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, like phrenologists, which was a pseudoscience, hugely popular, that connected the shape of one's skull or head and the bumps on it to your personality. Adams also grouped Emerson with the French revolutionary Marat, and said that they were ingredients in the bubbling cauldron of religion and politics. In my reading of this, Quincy Adams, Emerson had become a revolutionary, at least in his rhetoric. And if you know anything about John Quincy Adams was no revolutionary. And in fact, very few statesmen in the United States have been revolutionaries. And in fact, the few who have, like Lincoln, eventually becomes a revolutionary, but he's pressed into it. And the reason for that is that a revolution is a state in society in which radical change happens immediately. And especially in democracies, it takes a long time for progress to occur. But the problem with the revolution is, I've used the metaphor of a bowl. In a democratic society, when you pour water into the bowl, it sinks to the bottom, and then it slowly rises. A revolutionary society in democracies, you turn the bowl over and you pour water on the bowl, it splatters in every direction, and you don't know which direction it's going in. It can go into liberal or conservative directions, or radical or anti-radical. As I said, Emerson grouped Emerson with Garrison in phrenology, the French revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat, and the bubbling cauldron of religion and politics, which existed for much of the antebellum period. Questions or comments? I've been talking too long. I want to hear how you responded. How many of you have never read Self-Reliance before? Really? Emerson is no longer as popular as he once was. I mean, I've been here 25 years, and every undergraduate read Emerson.
Are you sure?
Yes. So how did you respond to Emerson's Self-Reliance? Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I haven't read Emerson, I think, because I'm not American. But reading him, I heard a lot of Nietzsche.
Yes. That's a great, Nietzsche himself was hugely inspired by Emerson. In very different ways, but Nietzsche loved Emerson. Anything else? Yeah.
One thing that I found quite interesting in it was this concept of a call to courage and how
Of a what?
of a call to courage.
Uh-huh.
So it sort of encourages people.
Do you want to use this?
I speak loudly.
Okay.
The fact that it was a bit of a call to courage and it encouraged people to go down their own path.
Uh-huh.
In particular, the line, trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string.
Right. It's a fascinating line. So what's your question?
It's more of a comment.
Oh, okay. Yeah. How many of you found Emerson's writing, his style, his rhetoric captivating? A few. How many of you found it boring? 2. How many of you disagreed with him? No one disagreed with Emerson? Yes. Do you want to?
One thing I did kind of find was how strong the individualism with his religious beliefs were. Do you think that's had a kind of impact in how some citizens maybe respond to something like a social safety network, where they might not be as willing to
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, maybe there might not be as willing to accept sort of public help, government help, because they view themselves as needing to be totally self-reliant and independent of external.
Yes, yes. That's a very good point. I mean, Emerson's audience is what we would now call middle class or above audience. Emerson was, I mean, he was educated a bit. He met Frederick Douglass. In fact, when he gave his West Indian Emancipation address, he asked Douglass to attend, to be there. But Emerson, I mean, being out in Concord was a lot different from being in Boston or Cambridge. He was, it took a lot longer for Emerson, who was, he said he was naturally anti-slavery, but it took a long time for him to actually speak out against slavery and to recognize the inhumanity of slavery. So that's a very good point. And his chief audience were an audience of intellectuals, whereas and this was the golden age of oratory. The golden age of oratory where public speaking could command high revenues, fairly high pay. It was an entrepreneurial vocation, and it was a vocation that could, as I said, make you become not only famous, but economically quite comfortable. And it was a vocation that was limited almost primarily to the North, because, as we've mentioned, it was the North who took federal money or used federal money often free to create a network of roads, canals, towns, cities in a way that the South refused to, because they recognized that if we create roads and we create an infrastructure in the southern states, it's easier for slaves to escape. But Emerson was his basic audience was an audience of educated men and women, who were very much drawn to language and literacy and the arts, of which this was one. Other thoughts? He says, there is a time in every man's, this is classic Emerson, there is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to him to till. The power which resides in him is new in nature, and none but he knows what that is which he can do, nor does he know until he has tried. In this sense, he resembled closely Whitman, and both, which I'll get to in a second. But Emerson and Whitman both saw all humans as unique, and that was a good thing. That each human is distinct, each human voice is distinct, and so instead of trying to mimic other voices that you are inspired by, the goal is to develop your own unique voice. Yes.
I think the one thing that stands out to me, even though the style is not my preference, I can still appreciate the content. And I think the one thing that stands out to me the most, if you compare it to today, is that it feels like what he's doing is he's taking the wisdom of the moment and giving it to everybody. But really, I read it as like a message for like the next generation. Like, take this with you and run with it.
Yes.
Whereas I feel like if you compare that to today, like, who is our Emerson type? It's like, I mean, you can point to like a lot of the technocrats or like, Musk. There's so many people following different styles. There is less of this
Yes.
individual sense. And frankly, like, some of the messages in here, even though I agree with them entirely, because I think they are very American.
Right.
Like individualism, like you can do it, like the grit, the strike. I think that those kinds of messages today
Yes,
that way
yes,
anymore.
yes.
So it's interesting because I think that we've kind of like strayed in a way,
Right.
and I do think we still need wisdom, and we don't necessarily have it.
Yes,
We don't have
yes,
our Emerson of this moment.
yes. No,
We need
We
it.
don't have what?
we don't have our Emerson at this moment, and we need it. No, I think that's a very, very good point. Thank you for sharing that. I would say that the one clarification is that Emerson, his audience were mostly middle-class audience. There were African Americans, there were what we would now call maybe lower middle class or even working class people. But in the North, being working class was being an artisan. One received the fruits of one's own labor, so that was an inspiration, which was very different from what we'll get to with an industrialized society. And in fact, it was the South that was industrialized through the slave trade and through cotton. Yes.
I was surprised by the turn he makes of property.
The what?
The way that he treats property.
Yes.
At the end of
Yes.
the paper.
Yes.
And that stood out because I get the individualism and I can see
Yes.
the roots of like American democracy in that.
Yes.
But then for property to receive criticism
Yes.
and protection in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, I was surprised when that showed up.
Yeah. So how do you interpret that?
Well, I interpret him as trying to say, well, self-reliance is reliance purely on the self, away from any accumulation of accidents or things that could be taken away.
Yeah.
And providence, like property.
Yes.
So to cultivate that voice of like God or that
Yes, yes,
bit of self,
yes.
you can't allow yourself to depend on stuff outside of you, even property. So
Yes.
it should lead to maybe some kind of other relation to it.
Yeah, that's very good. Having faith in oneself. And having faith in oneself is also faith in God, because God is within you. So there's a way that prevents someone like Emerson. Emerson he inherited, his parents were wealthy, his grandparents were wealthy, but Emerson was really never interested in money. Neither was Thoreau. As long as it was enough to help him support himself, he simply wasn't interested in it. Which it's a great line you highlight, is that self-reliance is God's reliance. An interesting question would be, how would Emerson respond to someone who said, I'm an atheist, but I still believe in self-reliance? I don't know how he would respond. There were very few open atheists at the time. Yes.
I had a question.
Can you speak up?
I had a question. We were talking about industrialization and how the artisans, I guess, or his audience was the middle class, the artisans, they were able to, I guess, enjoy the fruits of their own labor, whereas in an industrial society, you don't have that as much. But why do you, I guess, make a distinction? Because in an industrial society, is it impossible for people to, I guess, have the fruits of their own labor? Like, if
In industrial society, what?
how is it that people don't enjoy the fruits of their own labor? Because it's like, if I guess the person who owns a company or business, if they, purchase the machinery and the factory and all these things, then why is it that, I guess, what they receive from that is less so the fruits of their own labor than would be in an artisan, like what an artisan is?
Well, a lot of artisans own their own small businesses. I mean, that's what an artisan is that they are an independent entrepreneur, and whether it's as a blacksmith or a cooper, making things for others as well as for yourself. Most farmers, you could say that they had a small business. That most artisans were farmers. So the family had a plot of land. They sold some of the crops to other communities and towns to make some money, but they also they sustained themselves from what they grew on the farm. Does that make sense? And whereas industrialization is that you have no say in how much money you make and in what kind of work you do. I mean, we'll get to this with Henry Ford and others. I mean, if you work on an assembly line of an automobile company, you don't have a say of what you want to do and what your salary is and the ability to make more of a salary or less, or to buy or sell aspects of that company, which artisans do. So they have artisans, in an artisanal society, individuals have far more autonomy in terms of choosing, what to purchase, what to sell, what kind of thing you're gonna make, or how you'll participate in the economy of the society. Does that make sense?
So, John, I think that this conception of
Pardon me?
the conception of work in the 19th century, right?
Yes.
So let's say there are three large conceptions of work, and tell me which you think is being invoked by Emerson and by the people around him. So one is work is an honorable calling. So
Right.
the person earns a living,
Right.
And has pride in a trade, in the mastery of a profession or a trade,
Right.
which sustains a way of life in the community.
Right.
And that was the canonical conception
Right. Right.
in the 19th century.
Right.
Then there's the conception of work as a transformative vocation, which is a conception that began in the intelligentsia
Right.
and then spread.
Right.
Right. And in a sense, the pastors were part of the intelligentsia.
Yes. Yes.
So there the conception is you transform yourself by transforming the world.
Right.
And you discover the possibilities of inner transformation through the struggle to transform the world.
Right. Right.
The material reward for that it may be necessary, but in a way it's accidental, it's marginal.
That's
to
right.
the main aim.
That's right.
And the third idea of work, which has now become the predominant idea, I suppose, is the purely instrumental.
Right.
Work has no inner sanctity.
Right.
It's not the road to salvation,
Right.
but it is necessary to sustain a life.
Right.
And the true rewards of subjectivity lie in the private life,
Right.
in the family, in the tastes and adventures of the individual.
Right.
The rest is just the prop.
Right.
Now, how does Emerson relate to these three ideas?
He is. He is number two.
The transformative vocation.
Yeah. So he is. I mean, as artisans, they have a vocation. Whether it's, as I said, most of them are farmers, but they saw that as their vocation. But he wanted to use his vocation as an orator writer, both, I would argue, in self-transformation of continually evolving, as frankly his style does. His early writings are very different from his later writings.
So the idea of a vocation, and by extension, a transformative vocation, is a Lutheran idea.
Yes,
It's an idea
yes,
of Luther.
Yes, yes.
And it has a background in Protestant Christianity.
Yes, that's right. That's right. In fact, that's right. It's very much a background in Protestant Christianity. That's right. Yeah. And that was true with, as I said, the vast majority of Northerners. And I think the three characterizations that you outline are appropriate for understanding them. Thoreau, in his essay on walking, so I didn't assign it, but his essay on walking pities and almost condemns the shop owners, the small shop owners, that's their vocation, who don't seem to be happy, and especially for Thoreau, who don't seem to be inspired by the beauty and the power of nature, of nature, which Thoreau was in love with. Great. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Was the essay on walking?
It's just walking. It's just walking. Yes, yes. It's a terrific essay. I've assigned it for other classes. It's a terrific essay, and it's about people walking in this area. And most of you probably don't know this, is walking was hugely popular in Boston, especially. And Boston was the cultural center of the nation until after the Civil War. It was very much ahead of New York City, and at the war, and following the war, New York City became the cultural capital. But Bostonians, and in suburbs like Concord, where Thoreau lived, walking was seen as a very positive thing. It was hugely popular, so much so that one of the first organized sports, in fact, arguably the first organized sport before football, which starts at Harvard, is walking. Pedestrianism is what they referred to it. And in fact, there were buildings in Boston that had essentially like a track around it. And the competition was you walked until you passed out. And the last one walking in the number of laps was the winner, and they had prize money. It was hugely popular. I mean, just another anecdotal example, which is very common. Charles Sumner, who, while he was at Harvard as a Harvard undergraduate, with 3 friends, walked from essentially this site to Maine and back between Friday and Sunday, just because they love pedestrianism. And Emerson was a walker. Thoreau was a walker. Many of Thoreau's essays are on not just the tidal walking, but walking up mountains and in the further north. But it was part of, in the largest sense, part of this artisanal sensibility. And especially given the competitive nature of it. Yeah, I mean, this line captures Emerson's understanding that God or Christ or the Spirit is within me and you. It reflects almost a Quaker-like sensibility, where he says in Self-Reliance, everywhere I am hindered of meeting God in my brother because he has shut his own temple doors and recites fables merely of his brothers or his brother's brother's God. Essentially, instead of borrowing from someone else, you develop your own ideas and insights. Understandably, Southerners hated Emerson. I mean, Emerson really never, he rarely openly called himself an abolitionist. And the difference between abolitionism and anti-slavery is that the abolitionists were, the best way to summarize it, they were radicals, they were revolutionaries. They recognized that the scourge of slavery, that slavery is to do violence against another human being, and it's a state of war. They recognized that slavery is a state of war, meaning that without violence or the threat of violence, slavery cannot exist. And abolitionists, because of that, advocated for an immediate end to slavery, and in theory, they believed in racial equality. And Emerson, by the late 1850s, had become an abolitionist, but certainly not during this speech. And anti-slavery folks were people like Lincoln, which we'll get to in a second, Whitman until the war itself. And that is they hated slavery. Essentially, they're the liberals. They hated slavery. Slavery was a scourge. Slavery was inhumane. Slavery contradicted God. But the aim is not to uproot and transform immediately society, but to gradually overturn it. Essentially, the difference between liberals and radicals, liberals and revolutionaries. Now, what happens in the 1850s, which Emerson recognizes, so does Whitman, and that is anti-slavery advocates and abolitionists converge, unite. They recognize their differences, but they also recognize the way in which liberals and radicals working together can actually, that's where you can best achieve social change. Southerners hated Emerson. He was popular enough where a number of his pamphlets, and the pamphlet was the way in which you circulated speeches that you had given. It's a way for an order to make more money. And in fact, Southerners burned Emerson's pamphlets, and the Southern states were truly a kind of a closed society as it related to debates over slavery. John Quincy Adams ended up grouping Emerson with William Lloyd Garrison, and he said he likened Emerson and Garrison both to the French revolutionary Jean-Paul Moreau, and said they were of the same ingredients in the bubbling cauldron of religion and politics. So this is Adams, who's really not making a distinction between anti-slavery folks and abolitionists.
So, John, it seems to me that in the background of this discourse here about the prophets, there are these two debates, right? One is the debate that I was asking you about before, about work.
Right, right.
Should work be just an honorable calling? Should it be a transformative vocation? Or should it just be an instrumental?
Right, right.
And true sanctity lies in the pianissimo of the private life, right?
Right.
And that debate has an unsatisfactory outcome.
Right.
Because
Right.
the idea of the honorable calling seems to be an archaic idea. It's both morally archaic.
In terms of today or in terms of then?
In terms of today, certainly,
right.
but already in terms of then. That is, that the idea that because with the Romantic movement, which is part of the background of this in the 19th century, the archaic character of the notion of an honorable calling begins to be apparent, right?
Right.
But the idea of the transformative vocation is a doctrine for intellectuals.
Yes, that's
And
right.
is an elitist doctrine, right? Which is not yet available to the mass of humanity. And the third idea, the instrumental idea of work, is giving up.
Right.
That the whole public life of work, the material life, is just there for its instrumental uses. It has no sanctity.
Right.
It has no role in the improvement of humanity. So that's one debate. And that debate ends in an unsatisfactory place, because the higher thing is an elite thing. And the other two things, the instrumental and the honorable calling, are desanctifying or archaic.
I would say in 1840s and 50s, it depended on where you lived, and there were numerous examples of both men and women who grew up. They had a small farm or a small business, and they did not make a lot of money. But they found their calling through speaking and through words.
You mean as preachers? Or?
As preachers or as public speakers.
Yes.
As public speakers, which was,
That is a kind of quasi-intellectual
yeah,
activities.
Yeah, it was a quasi.
Continuing this logic that the solution there was to make work more than just instrumental. So
Exactly.
it's not just the third idea.
Right.
To make it more instrumental, it has to be connected to the world of ideas
Right.
in some way.
That's right. Which is
And a persuasion.
that's right. That's exactly right.
Now, then there's a second debate implicit in this discussion that we're having, which is a debate about the labor relation.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So there are, again, three ideas of three forms of work. There's slavery,
Right.
which is war,
Right.
violence. Then there's self-employment.
Yes.
Self-employment and cooperation.
Right.
huh?
Right.
Which was close to being the 19th century ideal.
Yes.
The ideal to which Lincoln refers in
Yes.
the talk to the Wisconsin
Yes.
Agricultural Society and so
Yes.
forth.
I mean, so I'll get to this, but Lincoln famously said that I believe that every man and woman, including black women, have the right to receive the fruits of their own labor.
Yes. And then there is the third thing, which is the wage labor,
Right. Yes.
which was to become naturalized as the natural form of free labor only at the end of the 19th century.
That's exactly right.
Because
That's exactly right.
up to the end of the 19th century, it was contested,
Yes. Yes.
both by liberals and by socialists.
That's right. That's
And
right.
they said wage labor is not the natural form of free labor.
Right. That's right.
So, and they were unable to give a practical expression to this idea.
That's right.
That they could organize a modern economy
Right.
with economies of scale and scope,
Right.
large-scale aggregation of resources,
Right.
the premise of economic dynamism,
Right.
without appealing to the corporate form and to the wage relation.
That's right.
Huh?
That's right.
So that was a failure.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
And so we can go back and relate the two debates in the following way. This is just a proposal I make to you, that the failure to find a solution to the problem of work and therefore of the individual
Right.
is related to this failure to find a way of reproducing non-wage labor in the age of the modern economy.
That's right.
huh?
That's right.
And that this failure was beginning to become apparent in the period that we're discussing.
It's just beginning
Yes,
to.
because it becomes fully clear
Yes.
only at the end of the 19th century.
That's right. It
And
was.
then you have the
yes.
corporate form, you have
Yes,
wage
yes,
labor.
that's, which we'll get into. And it actually happens earlier.
And
It
with
happens-
wage labor, you have the instrumental idea of work.
Right.
You give up any idea
That's
of
right.
sanctity of
That's
work.
right.
You abandon the archaic notion of the honorable calling,
Yes.
and you descend into the inferno of instrumental work.
No, that's right. Although it happens actually earlier than the late 19th century.
Yeah.
The Civil War is the major catalyst for bringing about industrialization
Yes.
in the North.
But
you're
I think that
absolutely
what's interesting in that story and in the relation between those two debates is the connection between the spiritual ambition
right.
and the material and institutional constraints of society.
Yes.
And it's all very obscure, right? Because these categories that I'm using were not apparent to them then at their own time. This is our retrospective light
Right.
on
right.
this situation.
Right. But Emerson, at least the prophets were discussing, they say Emerson and Whitman in particular, they, in their speeches, they disseminated a vision of religion subtly that reflected their own beliefs that God or Christ was within you and within me and within all people.
But
So in
this-
other words, And in fact, in Boston at this time, if you were Irish Catholic, there was huge discrimination. There was greater discrimination against the Irish Catholics than there were against African Americans in Boston, in part because there are a lot more Catholics and they were seen as much more threatening.
I was trying to bring this closer to this debate that I briefly evoked in our first class. I
Right,
said,
right.
in the world now, most people are poor and disorganized,
Yes.
but their horizon of aspiration,
Yes.
rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois.
Yes.
And that's now the majority of humanity.
Exactly.
The majority of humanity wants to have a small farm, a little shop,
Yes.
a trade for which they can charge.
Yes.
So it has to be one of two things, right? Either they're going to be the subjective petty bourgeoisie, the
Right.
would-be petty bourgeoisie
Right.
is going to become an objective petty bourgeoisie.
Right.
They're going to become a small business class.
Yes.
The small business class is going to become the predominant class in the country and in the world.
Yes.
And it's hard to see how that can happen, because then the form of economic activity and the spiritual experience that goes with it is archaic. It's the world of small shops, of restaurants, of laundromats, of little businesses, archaic, isolated family business, dependent on self-exploitation and family saving. The alternative to that is you find you offer this subjective petty bourgeoisie
Right.
an alternative to begin to take a place in the new economic order,
Right.
which is the knowledge economy.
Right.
And the project becomes to replace the knowledge economy for a few by a knowledge economy for the many.
Right.
And then you can begin to give reality to this dream
Yes.
that the idea of the transformative vocation doesn't become just for the intelligentsia.
Right.
It becomes for ordinary humanity.
Yes.
And we begin to devise property regimes that could become the device of this new economy, right? In which everyone is not just a wage earner working instrumentally.
Right.
But that's very far away. That the
Yes.
way, in the words in which I describe it, it sounds like utopian.
Yes. I mean, in this stage.
So this is the description of a sickness, right? This is a way of describing our sickness.
Yes.
So we're talking about these people like Emerson and so forth, but we should really be talking about ourselves, right? We could translate this into a discussion about our pathology.
Yes.
We can't do it.
Right.
They couldn't do it. We now should have more light. We should come closer.
Yes.
More, because we have more ideas that could signal in this direction.
Yes.
And we have more of the instruments, the material instruments.
Yes. No, that's very good. I mean, there are a couple exceptions. So, for example, I mean, just the influence of the Lyceum circuit in the antebellum period. I mean, as I mentioned, it's one of the huge.
But it's a debate that has to do with everything. I mean, take, for example, technology.
Right. That's
So-
right. That's right.
What's the right way to think about technology? It's about, one of the ways to think about it is, it's about this frontier between what we've already learned how to repeat and what we don't yet know how to repeat, right? So everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we embody the formula or algorithm in a machine. So the point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then, so from that standpoint, then, we would never say, as people are now saying, the entrepreneurs are now saying, that the aim is to produce artificial intelligence that is a surrogate for the human mind, that is like the human mind. The aim,
Yeah, that's right.
the aim is to produce a machine
Right.
that is as different as possible from the human mind. That is the opposite
Right.
of the human mind. Because the machine has computational power
Right.
to a high degree,
Yes.
which we don't have.
Right.
And we have imagination,
Right.
which is the ability to subsume things under a range of transformative variation.
Right.
So our success in achieving that other world in which the transformative vocation is not just for the intellectuals.
Right. Right.
And,
That's correct.
and the alternative to wage labor then once again becomes the predominant form of free labor, depends on all this detailed economic
Yes. Yes.
and technological stuff.
Yes.
Like what we do with artificial intelligence.
That's right.
What logic of evolution we imprint on technology. And that's the problem. So we're like thousands of miles away from that.
Right.
That's
right.
not even part of our debate.
That's right.
Huh?
That's right.
So I have difficulty even in expressing the terms of the debate.
Right. Right.
And so it seems to me very unrealistic for us to be talking about this 19th century experience as if it were ancient history, right? It's the early form of our own tragedy.
Yes, but there, as you point out, there are a few lingering examples of that artisanal form of work and of identity and livelihood, but they're tiny. Whereas in the antebellum North,
And they lack this attribute of large scale of aggregation of resources,
right.
which is the key to realism.
right. That's
Because
right.
otherwise it's like a joke.
That's right.
It's a throwback.
That's right.
It's not for real.
That's right. And another example is the degree to which for virtually every northern survivor, even if the man did not serve in the war, did not serve in the army, virtually every northerner at the end of the war, beginning in Reconstruction and then expanding and accelerating afterwards, understood that it was a new world. It was a new society, totally different from what had occurred or what existed before the war. And a huge number of people were trying to wrap their heads around it and try to understand it and how to live happily in this brand new, radically industrialized society.
Now, despite the enigma, right, the lack of a solution,
Right.
something that I find immensely potent and encouraging in this American experience is this idea that the spirit and the alternative and the new and the salvation lies in the banal, in the ordinary, in the experience of ordinary men and women.
Yes,
In the unlovely, prosaic stuff of ordinary life.
Yes.
That seems to me the most attractive thing in this American experience.
Yes. No, I agree. I mean, Whitman is the best in articulating
What's unattractive is the lack of imagination.
Right.
What is attractive is the search for salvation in the ordinary, in the shadowy world of the commonplace.
Right. That's right. That's great. That's very good. Let me jump to let's see what. Is there a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I really liking the way that our conversation was just going, kind of circling back to the debate from last class, about kind of bringing together high energy democracy, and
Yes.
especially I was interested in kind of the place of the artist. And just going off of that before we get completely off the topic, about the transcendentalists, like I used to love Emerson in high school, and then now, looking at this, revisiting it now, thinking about us, like in today's society, I agree, like, are they really a model? Like, can we actually really
Yeah, yeah.
are, and is that why we don't have those larger scale kind of examples of people being able to express their inner spirit outside of the economic system?
That's a,
Yes.
This kind of responds to that somewhat, and to some of the other comments from earlier.
Louder if you could.
Is that better? Yes.
Yeah.
This responds to that comment and a few of the others from earlier. So I think when we're talking about Emerson, we use the word self-reliance, and I think the default understanding of that word is very different than how Emerson understood that word. I think the key paragraph in self-reliance is the paragraph that starts with "life only avails unto having lived."
Right.
And that paragraph he says, "To talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking. Speak rather of that which alive this in person is." It's the paragraph about becoming, which
right.
I forget who was this, Duke Nietzsche observer.
Yes, that's the, hence the connection. Yes,
The fount of Nietzsche.
yes.
In a similar way that Emerson's the fount of Whitman, who, so your comment and the comment from over there earlier about, solidarity and communal efforts and seeing self-reliance and sort of attention with these community building things, I do think, that reading more Emerson, like essays like The Oversoul and a few other essays, do sort of link up this sort of becoming self-generative, self-reliant self with a sort of becoming generative community, and then nature beyond that community. Of course.
Yes, yes.
So I do think, I think a better way to look at self-reliance is not as this sort of closed off, this self that's reserved, but rather trying to get at the generativeness of the self. And that generativeness is sort of always an adaptation to and an interaction with some part of nature, some part of the world.
That's
So
very
actually,
good.
The self-reliance, even when you talk about a more internal self-reliance, it's still one part of yourself adapting to becoming with the moment, another part of yourself.
Yes.
And of course, I'm trying to bootstrap Emerson to this sort of broader liberal democratic, tribal and social and individual sort of whatever view. But as we'll see, I'm sure in a second, Whitman does it much more powerfully.
Yes, yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, you want to add one thing?
Yeah, no, this is awesome, and I feel like maybe, because I totally agree, and I think that Emerson does leave room for himself to be interpreted in a different way. I
Right.
guess I'm trying to piece together how did we as a society get this so wrong?
Right.
Because reliance on the self, we're missing that kind of iterative approach of being able to look at ourselves, kind of take knowledge, adding to the body of knowledge, like what
Right.
scientists do,
Right.
Like what creatives, in the sense of the underground creative communities that still exist, try to do. Art is not competitive. Ideas are not competitive. We're supposed to build off of one
That's
another.
right, that's right.
And so I totally agree. And I guess that's where I think technology is so interesting, kind of like
Yes, yes.
it's just repeating
Yes,
each other, it's
yes.
talking over each other.
So two
Yes,
things,
that's
the
very good.
the technologies and the institutions,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Because you referred to these large projects that we evoked in earlier classes of the knowledge economy for the many, the high energy democracy. And what are these projects? These projects are, they're instruments of the materializations of the imagination, right? Because what is the imagination? The imagination has two crucial moves. One move is distancing from the phenomenon, and the other move is a subsumption of the phenomenon under a range of transformative variation. That's how we understand it. Anything, right? We understand it by having an idea of what it can become at the next step, right? And so these institutional projects like the high energy democracy and the knowledge economy for the many are institutional instruments of the imagination, the perpetual creation of the new, right? And this sort of
Yes, perpetual,
and that has to be married to an idea about technology. The technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. It has the logic that we give to it.
Right.
And we should act under the principle that no human being should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. The work that can be done by a human being should by definition be the work that a machine cannot do.
Right.
And then the combination of the machine and the worker, the person with imagination, is immensely more powerful than either of them alone.
That's right.
And this leads, so this is all related in my mind to a moral judgment that one might pass on the American experience. And maybe it's inappropriate to pass judgments on national experience.
No, go ahead.
But the distinctive qualities of the American people are generosity, good faith, energy.
Yeah, lots of energy.
Those are the distinctive qualities. Their defects are their lack of imagination and their self-deification. And this is the solution. This is the response to that.
I would say the exception for the lack of imagination is among artists. You know, for them, imagination
Well,
is...
of course, but the problem is that the imagination should not take refuge in a corner of society. It should be in the central place.
But that's exactly what people like Emerson and Whitman and
Yes, it
Frederick
was the
Douglass
fire.
are trying to do.
That was the fire.
Yes.
So I think what Emerson is evoking is life, vitality, right?
Yes.
And Hölderlin said, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive," right? So that's that's the source of everything.
Yes, that's right.
And that's related to imagination.
That's right. That's right.
And is the alternative to the self-deification, because
Yes.
the Americans, they haven't been inclined to develop these institutional projects. Why? Because they have this enormously vital experimentalism, another of their characteristic qualities, together with good faith, generosity, energy, experimentalism. Experiment about everything.
That's right.
But then they've accorded to their institutions, their economic and political institutions, an exemption from the experimentalist impulse. We will experiment with everything except our institutions, notably the Constitution, the cult of the Constitution,
Yes.
which is
That's
apostasy, right? A crime. The reification of the institutions, and then we can't resolve this problem, like these problems we were just discussing.
Right. No, that's very good. The other thing I would mention that we haven't yet is the degree to which competition plays a big role in this artisanal society. You know, especially as speakers. I mean, the public speaking circuit, the Lyceum circuit, was huge, and when you read the private letters, they assess their own speeches. They say, "Oh, you know, so and so gave a better speech than I did. I need to like up my game," and that kind of competition in this artisanal society was actually a source of inspiration for a lot of orators and writers, and so it was positive, it was fruitful. Once competition emerges within an industrial system, it becomes much more problematic in a sense, because here you have large numbers of people on an assembly line just picked, and everyone has the same pay. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about the idea of the knowledge economy for all. To me, that kind of sounds like the promise of a myth that we had pre sort of like quite aggressive globalization, where it was like America and other wealthy nations were going to transfer to a high-skilled, highly educated economy. But that probably wasn't the case. There was outsourcing of labor, which meant there was greater economic inequality. So I guess I somewhat struggle to know what's meant by a knowledge economy for all.
Well, no, it's not very complicated. There was an the most advanced practice of production up to the end of the 20th century was conventional industry for this mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor. And in the whole world, the idea is that there was a shortcut to rapid economic growth. The shortcut to rapid economic growth was conventional industry. You took resources and workers away from agriculture and put them into industry. And the message of development economics is that this shortcut depended ultimately on fundamentals. And there were two fundamentals, education and institutions. Institutions were the security and property right, and the education, they paid lip service to. The reality was they didn't need much education to work in a Fordist factory. All you needed was manual dexterity, especially in the form of hand-eye coordination, a disposition to obey, and elementary literacy and numeracy. Now we have something completely different. Conventional industry is being destroyed all over the world. It's in recession. In the United States, it's called the Rust Belt.
Right.
And the dominant idea of both the Social Democrats and the right is buy it a few more years by subsidies, by tariffs, protect it, and so forth. The reality is it's not going to come back. It's done. And so a new vanguard has emerged, which we call the knowledge economy, dense in technology and capital, oriented to permanent innovation. And this new vanguard, unlike mass production, is multi-sectoral. It exists in every sector of the economy. But in each sector, it's an island, an enclave, that locks out the vast majority of workers and of firms. So the new vanguard in practice is an archipelago of these exclusive islands.
That's good. That's good.
And from this insular character of the new vanguard, there result two momentous consequences. On the one hand, economic slowdown. On the other hand, the aggravation of inequality. Anchored in the hierarchical separation, in the abyss that deepens between the vanguards and the rearguards of the production system. And compensatory progressive taxation and compensatory social entitlements are inadequate to master, to overcome these vast inequalities. That's the insular knowledge economy, and which instead of spreading through the whole economy, does the opposite, because its masters discover a way to bifurcate the process of production into two parts. The part that can be commoditized or routinized, they subcontract to businesses and workers in remote parts of the world, and the lucrative and creative part they keep for themselves. So it's a perversion of this dream of enlightenment and emancipation. That's what we have. So the category of a knowledge economy for the many designates the program of overcoming that, of taking this knowledge economy, taking its institutional arrangements, and taking its technologies and transforming them. Yes.
So I guess I completely agree with all the criticisms of the knowledge economy we have now. But I guess, so for the people who have been left out of the insular knowledge economy, what do they do from here? Is it a matter of we integrate them into the vanguard, or is it we strengthen other forms of industry?
Not into the same vanguard, into a vanguard that's completely different.
Right.
Because I think that it requires a complete It requires a different kind of education. It requires the formation of the accumulation of social capital, because this economy is a high trust economy, not a low trust command and control economy. And it depends on density of association. And finally, it depends on a long trajectory of legal and institutional innovation. And leading, which is no longer enough simply to impose on the pre-existing market order and the pre-existing system of private law a new system of regulatory and redistributive law, which is what was done in the 20th century. It's necessary to innovate in the basic formulas of private law, the property regime. The two crucial elements are technology and its direction, and the access to capital, to the capital resources of society. And just a thought experiment, imagine what that would mean projected far into the future. We'd say, for example, this is, of course, not anything for close to now. You would say, we vest the productive resources of society, technology and liquid capital, in independent trusts. No one owns them. They're vested in trusts that are organized under the law under different models of risk and return. And then people bid for the temporary use of these resources. So there's a rotating capital auction in
No one
society.
owns them, who controls them?
They're controlled by these trusts, but they're not owned. They're not owned. Everyone, the major means of production are temporary. So you could call it capitalism without capitalists, because no one has definitive ownership. Now, paradoxically, this speculative idea that I just described is the actual thesis of orthodox finance theory, because orthodox finance theory says a perfectly competitive capital market allocates resources to its most effective uses. It says it happens automatically. And what the thought experiment does is it tests that it actually happens. That's the transformation. So I think that the discussion we were having before about Emerson, the 19th century and so forth, points in the direction of these two sets of experiments. Experiments about institutions, especially the institutions of the market, and experiments about the direction of technology. So the technology, instead of replacing, empowers.
Yes, yes.
And this, I would want to claim, is the triumph of the imagination.
Right, right.
And a solution for the Americans, whom I've accused of being defective in the resource of imagination.
Yes, would you say Whitman is defective in the resource of imagination?
No, Whitman's a poet.
Right.
And what's so attractive in Whitman is the romance of the ordinary,
Yes,
of the
yes,
of the banal, right? As in the poem that you assigned.
Yes.
So everything that's unlovely, that's basic, and that comes from Christianity.
Yes.
That's where we find salvation.
Yes.
We don't find salvation in the noble.
That's right.
We find salvation in the base.
That's right.
That's the good side of the United
That's
States.
right.
The bad side is all this other stuff.
That's right. And Whitman is he's Quaker on his mother's side. He is deeply religious, as reflected in his poetry. and he saw God as immanent or indwelling within him, within all people, allowing them to overcome the burden of original sin and to reposition the fundamental locus of value in spiritual passions that become material and emotions rather than specifically or solely worldly authority and social conventions. And Whitman was very much a Democrat, a small d Democrat, a egalitarian. He said poets. He believed that poetry would be the way to achieve, or a catalyst for achieving democracy. And in fact, he wrote during a period of time in which every newspaper had a poetry column. And a lot of Americans, certainly Whitman would have, in fact, did paraphrase or quote Percy Shelley, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Why? Because poets, they aim to achieve harmony, unity, order, without limiting specific people through language, highlighting the power of language, whether it's one's voice or it could be one's singing or it could be one's dancing. But every human has, each human has a voice, and it's incumbent upon each human to articulate, to understand which voice is the most influential, which voice am I the most comfortable with. So Whitman has a expansive understanding of, in a sense, the idea of language itself. It's created and produced by the imagination. When expressed through poetry, Whitman happened to be a poet, language enables us to apprehend a higher beauty and truth. So for Whitman, form shapes meaning and content. You can't separate the form of your voice, the form of what you do, versus the content. They're inextricable.
Fortunately, he adopted a rebarbative style.
At times, yeah. I mean, another example, you're not reading it, but in fact, Whitman knew Frederick Douglass, and Douglass was very similar to Whitman in this sense. And in fact, Douglass refers to, he calls the imagination the peculiar possession and glory of humans. It's for Whitman, for Emerson, for most of these, what distinguished.
Because the imagination is about transcendence.
That's right, that's right, that's right. And the voice, developing your own unique voice of one kind or another. It doesn't have to be speaking. It could be pedestrianism, walking. Competing and walking, that would be an example. And orators competed on the Lyceum circuit. There was a kind of competition, but the competition was a way of inspiring people. In fact, Frederick Douglass, in this vein, said, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and that is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. So this just radical, progressive, visionary voice for creating a real democracy. Whitman was on the same page.
Less Owl of Minerva and more prophetic vision.
Yes. He was, I mean, his working job was as a journalist. He published a few poems in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, where he worked as a journalist. But his passion was the poetry, which he believed had the power to be transformative, yes.
So this is a question about Whitman and Emerson and the imagination aspect of this.
Right.
I think it's obviously like the generative space.
Yes.
People
Yes.
imagine a new America a different way.
Yes.
And how that relates
Right.
From how I understand neoliberalism, which is very much a lot of what goes on in America.
Right.
What you create must have value to be worth, to have worth. So if what people are creating doesn't necessarily have value, not everything we imagine has immediate value.
That's right.
A poem doesn't necessarily have value.
That's
like,
right.
You know, putting together a house and constructing it for somebody.
Yes.
So if the system that we're in right now is demanding that we compete to create value.
Right.
We're basically using human imagination, like we're constantly subduing human imagination.
Yes.
In a way that does not allow people to even see that imagination has any value.
Right. That's
other
very
than
good.
People who are like creating the big things. Like
That's right.
OpenAI.
That's
like,
right. That's
so
right.
I think what's really challenging to do this from a like ground up level or
Yes.
even from a lateral level is like how do we spike that without destroying the economy? I'm not saying neoliberalism is the only way. It's one of the ways. But how do we do that without like tanking an entire market? Because the market also matters for the capital to put behind
Yes,
the
yes,
imagination
yes.
and the dreams. And so I think it's hard because our values are not imagination necessarily for everybody. It's for some. Like some people
Yes.
have access to imagination.
Yes.
So this feels like a very difficult task against a massive like wave of economy that does not want to change.
But you're talking about the institutional reconstruction of the economy. The basic formula is the formula of disruptive innovation. You say, we separate an established thing from the creation of the new. So you have a system that facilitates and finances the creation of radical novelty, like these trusts that I described.
Right.
But you wouldn't want that to be the only system. You would want to preserve in the legal order the traditional absolute property right of the 19th century. Why? Because the great advantage of the classic property right is that it allows someone, the owner, to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in. And then, so the market economy has no single natural and necessary form. It should have a plurality of forms. Some of the forms should make it possible to combine stakes, but to relativize property. So in the abstract idea of the market, even at the most abstract level, there are two principles, right? One is absolute decentralization. The other is absolute control. That's the degree of control that the individual agents enjoy over the resources at their disposal. The orthodox notion of neoliberalism, of the economists, is that these two dimensions go together. But they don't go together. In fact, they're in contradiction. One of the ways in which to increase absolute decentralization is to relativize absolute control. That's what this little experiment of the trust does. But that shouldn't be the only way in which you organize a market. You should have the classic 19th century property right because it's a safeguard against the tyranny of the collective. And it allows the economic heretic to emerge. So you should have that also, right? Now, and what has been the problem in the United States? The problem has been this insistence of the Americans in exempting their fundamental institutions from the experimentalism that they apply to everything else. And then we have these great American thinkers from Jefferson to Dewey who tried to convince their fellow citizens to revoke the exemption accorded to the institutions. And they failed, right? They failed to do that. Thomas Jefferson believe that the Constitution of the United States should be trashed every 2 generations.
Right.
So that the dead wouldn't rule the living.
Right. Right.
So I think that what's interesting in this, and what we should regard as American, as in the American spirit, is to refuse to separate the material and the spiritual.
Right.
And to say that spiritual problems and material problems have solutions that intersect.
That's right.
Huh?
That's right.
And the spirit is on the cross of our material arrangements. Our ideals and interests are nailed to the cross of the practices and institutions that represent them. In fact, the law is the site of this crucifixion, and we have to politicize it to open it up, right?
Yes.
That's Christianity and that's democracy.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's interesting that neither Whitman nor Emerson nor Melville nor Lincoln, none of them they rarely invoked God himself or Jesus. It was almost a part. It was integral, the spirit within. So that it was that all people had that, and that was seen as part of humanity.
And a part of Christian orthodoxy is that the Christian doesn't know what God wants.
Exactly. So they were profoundly heterodox in their views, profoundly heterodox in their views. And Melville was, all of them were the same way. I mean, in Lincoln, a number of scholars to this day have argued that Lincoln was an atheist or a non-believer, which I totally disagree with. And they say it because he so rarely invokes Scripture, even though he was as deeply read in Scripture as was Douglas and many others, but he rarely invoked it until the war. And most notably in the second inaugural. I can go to that quickly. I'm going to be skipping Melville for now, which is actually a much more difficult text. We could talk about it next week, but this is his second inaugural address. Actually, this is a photograph from Alexander Gardner in which you see the three circles. That circle is Lincoln giving a second inaugural. Frederick Douglass has met Lincoln. They had called themselves friends. He has a front row seat. And the third circle on the upper balcony is John Wilkes Booth, who's scoping Lincoln out and at this point in time is planning to kidnap Lincoln and use Lincoln as ransom to release all rebel prisoners of war to regenerate the war for the South. And then he realizes, well, I'm just going to murder the guy, which he does. Lincoln, in his first or in his second inaugural, and he's very vague in how he understands religion, and there's been a huge debate. Does he see God as, it's certainly not indwelling or within the self? And a number of scholars have seen Lincoln as Calvinist, of not knowing God's will and looking for signs of God's will as a site or source of faith, as reflected in, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issues. So his understanding, he stands very much apart from Whitman and Emerson in particular, and Melville is much more like Lincoln in the relationship between his understanding of society, of himself, and of God or religion.
I think that's actually enough.
Okay. Yes.
Just earlier in your sort of introductory notes on Whitman, you were talking about his religiosity, his background in his religiosity. I agreed with all of it until you said something along the lines of, you seem to imply that Whitman believed in original sin.
That what?
You seem to imply that Whitman believed in original sin, which I would disagree with.
No, I didn't. I actually didn't say he believed in original sin.
Struggling with it, or some Quakers, something. You said something about original sin in the introduction.
Oh, that he was he, in a sense, he repudiated original sin, as did Quakers, as did other. I mean, Quakers came out of the English Civil Wars, the ranters, levelers, diggers. I mean, they repudiated certainly Quakers repudiated the idea of original sin. You have to, because the central tenet of Quakerism is that God or Christ is within you, and if He's within you, if He's part of us, you know, how can the self be battling sin and God Himself?
Yes, yeah, I must have misheard something you were saying about the Quakers.
Yeah.
But yeah, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
There can be a struggle within the self.
Yes, there can. There can. And you see, certainly with a lot of religions, or a lot of how people understand it, but Quakers Quakers were relatively cult-like. I mean, in early America, certainly in England, they lived together. They're Quaker communities, and because their faith was very different from Puritanism. That was also true after the Civil War. Quakers, as I said, they refused to participate in the Revolution. They refused to participate in all wars until the Civil War, in which a number of leading Quakers recognized the degree to which this is a golden opportunity to destroy the war of slavery. But that 95% of Quakers who served in the Civil War functioned as nurses. They were not soldiers. They were nurses, or they helped to build fortifications, but they were not soldiers. And following the war, there's a fairly long decline, in part because Quakerism, in a sense like Judaism, there's not the emphasis on saving souls and disseminating, on competing in a capitalist marketplace for faith. Whereas Puritans, all these others, they were very aggressive at competing and for faith and for souls, and my church is bigger than your church.
I propose we adjourn.
Yes. Any bits of last wisdom or anything that struck you as you read? Most of you probably read them before we adjourn. Yes.
I guess just because we didn't talk much about this inaugural text itself, I'm wondering if you could draw any through lines from Emerson and Whitman through Lincoln, or connect them in some way.
Yeah, so all three of them, Lincoln becomes much more religious during the war, and he always clarifies it, if God so wills. Whitman and Emerson would modestly.
Not presuming
Not
to know what
yes.
God.
Lincoln was much more humble in his understanding and faith.
His posture is a posture of sacrificial suffering.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Lincoln, he grew up just dirt poor. I mean, he also had he had less than 6 months or so of formal education. In this sense, he was similar. It was much more similar to someone like Frederick Douglass, who was born an enslaved person, than he was to Whitman, you know, or to certainly Emerson and Thoreau. But he loved the language from the time he was a kid. Like Douglass, I mean, some people, it's their passion is words. And then as the passion grows, they recognize that words can be very powerful. Language can be powerful.
It's a tremendous tribute to the United States that it could have produced someone like Lincoln.
Yeah. That's especially in a community where during this period, especially outside of the cities, which are fairly few in the north, people learn to read on their own. And the literacy rates in the antebellum North were higher than literacy rates in the United States are today. Which is a shocking statement to make, but that's according to literacy scholars the case. Most literacy scholars will say that argue that most Americans have never read an adult book. That the average literacy level is 6th grade, 7th grade. Which is why most movies are, and I've advised several filmmakers. In fact, one of them was Gary Ross, who's a filmmaker. I was having dinner with him, and we were talking, and he said, "John," he said, you need to speak and write for a 6th grade audience." And I said, I didn't have kids at this point. I said, "Gary, why would I want to do that?" And he said, "Because that's the average literacy level in the United States today." I actually didn't believe him. I had to look it up. That's what led me to analyze literacy scholars.
We'll meet again next week.
Yes. See you next week.
Gore Vidal
Yes.
defined an intellectual in the United States as someone who can read a book without moving his lips.
I love Vidal. I love his book on Lincoln. I met him. He was very charismatic. He was very charismatic. He actually gave a bunch of money to the police department at Harvard. Hi.
Quick question. Thank you so much. I know this is a good time, and I'll schedule all this first. But that was so fascinating. But it's just, I've been ruminating over. She asked about, we need an Emerson for today. But isn't it the reframing? Isn't it that we have too many Emersons right now, and we need to just kind of find the imagination that already exists?
Yes.
Because all of these ideas, all the imagination exists. It's
That's
just
right.
high energy
And that,
democracy.
I mean,
We need to uplift
yes,
it.
yes. And that,
Yeah.
but you're,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right. I mean, Emerson himself said, trust yourself. Don't borrow my
And
voice.
so the irony now is that we're all saying things, but nobody's
Yes.
finding that imagination.
And most writers, I mean, it's not just in writing or oratory, but most of the arts in general. You're drawn to something, you're just like, I want to be able to do that, but you can't help it from becoming your own thing. And then you develop from there. So that,
Not repeating.
exactly, that's right. That's right, that's right, that's right. And that's true with whether it's writing or reading or music or athletics, certainly. I mean, it's, which I see as an art form in one sense, yeah.
This is fascinating. So thank you. I want to be a professor one day about this kind of, I'm like, okay, I need to talk more with you guys, because this is the kind of stuff I'm like, because you're right, where does it fit in?
Right,
Academic
right,
discipline.
right, that's right.
Yeah, which is why we have to do this interdisciplinary kind of stuff.
That's right, that's right.
So thank you.